Hi, Dan.
Hello, hello.
How are you?
I am very well.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and in fact, this is The Wright Show. You are Dan Ariely, professor of psychology and behavioral economics at Duke, and you're well known for the book Predictably Irrational and the sequel, The Upside of Irrationality. But now you've got a brand new book out.
Yep.
The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, or so you claim.
That's
The
right.
subtitle is How We Lie to Everyone, Especially Ourselves. And so it's pretty self-explanatory what this is about. And it doesn't sound like good news.
No, it's mostly not good news. Basically, when we think about dishonesty, we usually have this model in which we think that there's some bad people and there's some good people. And the bad people kind of contemplate dishonesty and they think about what bad they can do and how they can cheat and steal and so on. And the good people are all like little angels.
Right.
But the reality is that there are bad people out there and there are fewer of them than we think, so that's maybe good. But all of us who consider ourselves good people can also cheat and be dishonest, and that's kind of the bad news. What is interesting is that we cheat just a little bit. We basically want to view ourselves as moral, wonderful people on one hand, we want to benefit from cheating on the other hand, and we find kind of a balancing act between the two of those such that we can cheat a little bit and still think of ourselves as good people.
Okay. That sounds like a happy state of affairs.
It's like that.
If we must be dishonest, we might as well feel good about it and be more or less oblivious to it. So you've done a lot of experiments on this, right? And one thing you found is that, I guess not surprisingly, our propensity to cheat does have something to do with how likely we are to be caught, right?
Not so much. So in our experiments, if you think about this idea of people trying to think good about themselves and trying to benefit from dishonesty, there's a question of what gets this ability larger and smaller. And there are some cases in which we think very carefully about our own morality, and therefore what we call the fudge factor shrinks, and people don't cheat a lot. And there are cases in which we're even more likely to turn a blind eye, and then our fudge factor increases. Now, when it comes to considering probability of being caught, time in prison, how much we stand to gain, those cost-benefit analysis things, turns out they don't really enter the calculation so much. So, for example, and even if you look at the data from the real world, outside of the lab, there was recently a study by the National Academy of Sciences, and they looked at what happened in states that have the death penalty. Now, the death penalty, that's kind of a big penalty. You can't get bigger than that. What happens when you have the death penalty? Are these states showing a vastly decreased amount of crime? Not really. Now, it's not an easy topic to study and so on, but nevertheless, the fact that the death penalty doesn't really change propensity to be dishonest suggests to you that in the small cases as well, people just don't think so much in terms of the long-term consequences.
Okay, but in your experiments, like when you did things like you would have people take these little tests and then report how many problems they solved.
Yep.
And then and before reporting it, they would put their test through what they thought was a paper shredder. So they thought you would have no way of knowing.
Yep.
And then they would turn to you and most of them exaggerated how well they had done. I assume that the paper shredder does increase. They're thinking that you don't have a way to find out must increase the propensity to lie somewhat, right?
Yeah, I think that if people knew that the propensity of being caught would be 100%, I don't think anybody would cheat.
Right.
But when the probability of caught is small, then if it changes, I don't think people would have any effect on that. For example, in our experiments, we did some versions in which we changed explicitly the propensity, the probability of being caught. We asked some people to shred half the sheet of paper, so half remained and had to be submitted as evidence. Some people shred the whole sheet of paper. Some people shred the whole sheet of paper, left the room and paid themselves for a bowl of money that had over $100. And when we ask people, what do you think is the probability of being caught in these conditions, people think it goes down dramatically. But when we ask them, and how much do you think people would cheat in those conditions? They say, we think people would cheat more when the probability of being caught goes down. So people think this is what will happen, but when we actually put people in those situations, we see that the amount of cheating is flat. It doesn't change with the probability of being caught. Now, I do think there's an exception that if we move to 100% probability, very different things would happen. But the low probability, and this is really the probability of being caught in all kinds of crimes, I don't think we see much action.
Okay. And so you take issue with what the kind of standard model, or what used to be the standard model of the kind of rational calculator who's cheating when the odds show that the opportunity is optimal and the payoff sufficiently great to warrant the risk.
And it's important to note that the rational model in this case is not just something that policyholders hold and economists hold. It's something that all of us hold, and it changes how we view life. Mm-hmm. So from a policy perspective, if you're the SEC and you're trying to regulate bad behavior in the stock market, if you think that people are doing the cost-benefit analysis, all you need to do is to have big prison sentences. And you would say as long as the prison sentences would be large, and everybody does the cost-benefit analysis, and they would say this is not worth it. But if people don't consider the long-term effect, then large prison sentences are not going to do anything. I mean, if you think about the last few weeks, we had quite a few cases of insider trading. How much do you think this would have an effect on the propensity for insider trading? I suspect it will have very little effect.
Of course, those are insider trading is a case where pretty much nobody expects to get caught, right? I mean, I think there is a thinking among some criminologists that you're right, the magnitude of the punishment is not the deterrent, but the probability of being punished actually is. I think that's still...
Yes, it's still, the probability I think matters much more than the magnitude of punishment.
Right.
But I think even the probability is vastly underestimated and underreported in its significance.
Okay. So
that's the first thing. The second thing is that, this model of a cold calculated criminal, like if you think anybody, Madoff, whoever, and you think about, let me look at this whole sequence of events that this person has done, could I have done that? And you say to yourself, no way, right? This is a very different person to who I am. But of course, the person who took all of these steps did not necessarily think about taking all of these steps. Maybe they thought about one little step.
Right.
And once they took that one little step, they became a slightly different person. Mm-hmm. They took a slightly different step and a different, and so on and so forth, the slippery slope.
Right.
And then I think finally it's also important to understand this effect in our own behavior. So we all have people working for us and with us, bankers and financial advisors and dentists and physicians and so on, and colleagues. And if we think that there are basically two people in the world, good people and bad people, then we say, let's just not hire the bad people. Let's make sure we only work with the good people. Mm-hmm. And that's why our physicians and our financial advisors could be somebody who has kids in our kids' school and we know them from work, or we have common acquaintances and so on. And as long as they're good people, everything would be right. But the cheating that we show is not the cheating of bad people. It's the cheating of good people. And we show that lots of good people are able, under the right incentive structure, which means that they have the conflicts of interest, plus they have very unclear rule and kind of large gray zones, they're able to misbehave. And I tell you, it's a tremendous burden to carry, because now every time I go to talk to one of those service providers, mm-hmm. I continuously think to myself, what is their bad incentive? Mm-hmm. What they might recommend to me that is not in my best interest, but in fact in their best interest. What might they recommend that is actually, they are blinded by their incentive structure not to see things in the way that is actually good for me.
So an example you bring up in your book is the dentist. I mean, in recent years, some dentists have acquired the machinery to make crowns in their office while you wait. And in fact, I've gotten some of these. And you say that gives the dentist an incentive to recommend that you get a crown. And that makes you suspicious. My dentist, I honestly, seriously believe, is a pillar of integrity and honesty.
Yes.
But you say people shouldn't make that assumption.
Yes, I'm sure you do, right? And I think once you meet somebody face to face, it's incredibly unpleasant to mistrust them. I tell you, it's an unpleasant thing, right? You have a relationship with those people. You put your health and you put your well-being in their hands, whatever profession they are, and all of a sudden it comes to the situation where you have to basically mistrust them. It's an incredibly uncomfortable thing to do. Mm-hmm. But when you understand that it's not about being good or being bad, it's about having conflicts of interest, that I think opens the door to be a bit more suspicious. And mm-hmm. I'll tell you, I had an experience with my dentist. So my dentist is usually very careful because he knows how I think about dentists. But there was one time I went there and there was a replacement person, one of his partners in the clinic, mm-hmm. and she looked at me. And she told me that the back tooth in the bottom left had a crack. The filling had a crack and I need to replace it. And we discussed whether to put amalgam, the silver filling, or enamel, the white porcelain filling, white or silver. And she basically told me that the white is much better than the silver. And I said, what do you mean much better? She said, oh, it's stronger, more durable, and so on. And I said, is there evidence for this? I said, oh, yes, yes. She said, it's getting much, much better. I said, getting much better doesn't mean it's actually better. It just means that it's not as bad as it used to be. And she said, no, no, no. There's evidence that the white stuff is much better for you. And I said, can you show me one piece of evidence for that? Because I got into trouble with dentists before, and I've read on some dentistry papers, and I couldn't find any evidence for that. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, I can't show you evidence for that, but trust me, it's much better. And I said, all the evidence I've seen point to the other way around, and I don't trust you, and I never want to see you again.
You said that to her?
I said that to her, and I tell you, it was very tough. It's very tough.
I imagine.
Because when you're in any of those situations, there's this hierarchy. And you might not think of yourself as being part of this hierarchy, but they wear a white coat and you don't, and it's their office and so on.
Right.
And all that make it incredibly difficult.
Right.
But for me, being armed with the knowledge of how conflicts of interest corrupt, I could do that. And I, on purpose, became a bit more aggressive than I usually would. And, I'm Israeli, so Israel is sometimes aggressive anyway. But I became extra aggressive because I hoped this would influence her moving forward as well. I don't know if that would work, but that was my hypothesis.
I think doctors are worse than dentists. I mean, when I ask a dentist how much something is going to cost, they tell me. But sometimes when you ask a doctor, they look offended that you would, that you would raise a question, and they say, well, I don't know. Talk to my assistant about that. I don't think about money.
Yeah, doctors hate this idea of thinking about money. I proposed once to the hospital here at Duke that they replace one of the television stations with a clock that shows the patient how much their bill is up to now. And they could show them the bill separately for what it would cost the insurance company and what it would cost them. And I wanted to know how fast people would release themselves from hospital under those conditions, how many painkillers they would want, how many meals would they want to have in hospital. And the doctors thought that was just evil, right? It was just evil to show people how much they're going to pay.
I think that the basic source of our dishonesty is not some sort of highly rational calculator inside weighing probabilities and rewards, and probabilities of being caught and rewards and so on. And I gather that your model instead is that, on the other hand, there is some constraint on the extent to which people cheat and lie. Most people are just moderate liars and cheaters.
That's right.
That's the good news. And I take it from your book that the main constraint on how much we lie and cheat is our need to think of ourselves as honest. Is that the idea?
That's right. So imagine that we're gauging our own honesty, and we like thinking of ourselves as honest. Now, honesty is not a continuum. It's not something you can say, oh, I'm 90% honest, I'm 87% honest. You're honest or not honest. What is interesting is that you don't have to be 100% honest to think of yourself as honest. You can be slightly dishonest and stay within that category. And then all of a sudden, if you take too many steps, you're out of that category, and then you think of yourself as dishonest. And it's staying within this category that is centrally important, and switching to moving out of it is kind of a big barrier. And now the question is, how big is that category? And the size of that category changes over time, and it changes with all kinds of things that allow us to rationalize our behaviors.
And what's kind of funny to me is that, we tend to think of cheating as a binary thing when we're talking about other people. In other words, we'll catch someone cheating once, and especially if we're not feeling sympathetically toward them, we will forever then brand them a cheater.
Yep.
We'll say that means that person is a liar, that person is a cheater. Whereas with ourselves, I think you're right, we're all aware of times when we fudged a little, but that does not move us into the cheater category.
That's right.
And I'm just kind of wondering, how do we reconcile those two seemingly contradictory frames of analysis?
Yeah, because when it comes to our own actions, we have lots of stories about why this is okay. Right? Why this company actually deserves this behavior, and why it was actually okay to give this particular information. I mean, the reality is that there's lots of human values, and we trade them with each other all the time. right? The prototypical, honey, you look great in that dress, right? It's basically a kind of a conflict between two values, wanting somebody else to be happy, maybe three values, want the night to be peaceful, and wanting to tell the truth, and they don't all reconcile. Now, one of those values is getting ahead in life. What happens with getting ahead in life kind of clashes with honesty. Now, what happens is we don't usually, and most people don't, basically abandon honesty altogether and just go with the financial rewards. But if we can do it a little bit, that's okay, as long as we frame it in terms that are compatible with viewing ourselves in wonderful ways. So if we can say things like everybody does it, or if you can say, this is just the way things are, or I was expected to do it, or this is the right thing to do.
Or the victim deserved it. So if your insurance company has, in your view, mistreated you,
that's right,
and you exaggerate something on a subsequent claim or something, you might consider that just the just desserts. Whereas if you hear that someone else falsified an insurance report, you would think that's a cheater.
That's right.
That's a
but
liar.
if you're doing it, maybe you're not just doing it you're restoring karma to the world. You're actually doing something positive by doing. You're helping the world move a step further.
And to what extent do we extend that leniency of judgment to our friends and our allies and our family? Is that part of
not that much,
bias?
because the rationalization process is not as easy to do for other people. Right? What happened is that you want to see the world in a certain way. I mean, think about this like a biased view in sports. When you like a particular team, everything you see is from the perspective of that team. Every call the referee is called, you think the referee is evil, vicious, or stupid, right? You think something is wrong because you have a motivated view of the world. When we look at things in a neutral way, we don't have this motivation. And therefore, we don't see the things in the same way. So what you need for this kind of cheating is you need to have a motivated pressure to see the world in a slightly different way. And then you have to have a selection of rules that you can follow, a large gray zone that you can follow so you can basically act on your motivated reasoning, and then under those conditions you might not recognize that you're behaving this way.
Okay. Now, there's a kind of as you mentioned, there's a kind of a zone of kind of marginal cheating or lying, and so long as we stay within that, it's easy to think of ourselves as not cheating. And you use the example in your book of a diet. So you occasionally violate the rules of your diet, you still think of yourself as on the diet.
Yes.
But there is some point beyond which, right, the kind of what the hell point, you call it, I think, or so, and at that point, so there is some point where if we go too far, then there really is a kind of a slippery slope in our deceptions, right? And we start thinking of ourselves in a different way.
As long as you can't reconcile your own actions with being good, and you think you've kind of overstepped the bounds, now you can't think of yourself as a good person anymore. And now many people have this idea of kind of going all the way. So if you think about dieting, many people experience the fact that they try to be on a diet, and then they eat a piece of cake or something, and then they say, you know what, I'm not a dieter, today's gone, I might as well have a fries and some burger and a shake maybe today. Now, of course, nature doesn't count calories this way, but we as people count it. And then you say to yourself, I'll start next Monday, or I'll start tomorrow, or maybe next month. But this period is over. And this is because of how we view ourselves categorically rather than a continuous way.
Okay. And this extends into all these areas. So it actually is true. I mean, the lectures you might get from a Puritan that if you start cheating, you'll turn into a criminal or a flagrantly dishonest person. It's not strictly true. You can, but it's true that the more you do it, the more you risk really moving into a different self-conception where the cheating would become or could become rampant, right?
That's right. And I think in this regard it's kind of useful to think about religion. So you could say, what is it about religion that causes people to behave better? Is it the fear of heaven and hell, like long-term consequences? I think the answer is basically no. That's not the issue. But if you think about religion as regulating our daily behavior to a high degree and creating very simple rules that we have to follow all the time, I think that's incredibly useful. Or think about something like Alcoholics Anonymous. I think the fact that I have a rule that you can't have any drink is really useful because it helps you know where you are. Are you drinking or not drinking? If you had a fuzzy rule that says you can have half a drink a day, all of a sudden you would say to yourself, how big is the glass? And what if you didn't have one yesterday? So rules are incredibly important to help us regulate our behavior because they tell us exactly where we are. And if you start violating them, there's no end how much you would keep on violating them.
And just little reminders, like when you looked at the Princeton Honor Code, the Honor Code at Princeton University, and you looked at some other universities that didn't have honor codes, you found that it's the act of signing the pledge right when you're taking the exam, right, that actually does reduce your chances of cheating.
Yeah, and in the same way we did with the Ten Commandments. We got people to recite the Ten Commandments, they stopped cheating. We got atheists to swear in the Bible and they stopped cheating. It's not about belief in God and fear of consequences. It's about reminding ourselves of our own moral structure. And the moment we remind ourselves, we notice ourselves with higher scrutiny, with higher details, and therefore we're more likely to behave better.
And what's the famous experiment where there's an opportunity to kind of steal some cookies or something from the and if they put a picture of a face up, right, doesn't that deter the...
That's right. So there's a very famous experiment in which pictures of eyes basically got people to behave better. But I think, again, the eyes are not about being caught. It's about more higher scrutiny of the self.
Okay, so, Dan, you also, I gather, view cheating and lying as kind of contagious.
Yes. So we did this experiment in which we asked what would happen if you would see other people cheat in an egregious way. And basically what happened is that people take cue from the other people who are cheating and they start cheating in a higher likelihood. Now what's interesting is that we don't follow everybody. We don't follow anybody who cheats. People follow people who are like them, belong to the same social group. If it's somebody completely stranger that you don't feel any connection to, that's not going to help. Not going to help. It's not going to affect dishonesty, but if something that you are connected to, somebody you can relate to, that would increase the herd activity in cheating.
So, among the things you should feel guilty about when you cheat and lie, if you're inclined to feel guilty, is not just the infraction itself, but to the extent that others become aware of it, you're actually increasing the amount of, or the probability of cheating and lying in society at large.
That other people will do it as well. Yeah, especially if it's become known. And actually, you can think about this vicious cycle that comes from the media. Because what do we advertise? What do we propagate? What information do we have as a society? We give the information about cheaters, right? We never stop and say, this athlete was found to take absolutely no drugs. Or this person was found to have no problems with their IRS taxes. We only have the problems that we promote. Now, if you're a person and you get this bias sample, you get only the bad things that are happening, what's happening to your own view of what is standard in society, to what is happening to other people, you're probably thinking that it's much more likely because you get the signal only from the people who deviate above the norm. And that, I think, has a very much a vicious cycle in which that's creating a tendency to show the other people that it's actually more normal than they think it was. And I talked a long time ago, I got an email from a guy who was a physician for athletes. And he told me that many of his athletes' clients actually were not doping, but they were seeing all this news about other people doping. And because of that, their belief was that they were completely unique. Now, he couldn't give them all the data about how many people are not doping because this was confidential information. But nevertheless, he said that every time somebody was advertised, some information about athletes doping, they changed their understanding of how common it is overall, and it increased their own desire to dope.
Yeah. I have a theory about Barry Bonds, actually. I think he did not start using steroids until Mark McGwire broke Roger Maris's season home run record, and there was widespread speculation that McGwire had started using steroids, and so I kind of think in a situation like that, I mean, if that's true, wouldn't you assume that the rationalization is what allows the person to do it without feeling as if they actually are guilty?
Yeah, so we can only speculate about that case, But one of the things we find is that if somebody feels like they're behind, and not for a good reason, they feel kind of they're pushed behind, but they're deprived from their own position because of some external unjustified pressure, they feel more justified to lie a little bit. And
I see. So it wouldn't have to be that your rival, that you believe your rival has cheated or lied. If you think that for whatever reason your being behind is unjust.
That's right. Your behind is unjust, and then of course if other people are doing it for that reason and other people are doping and this is just not fair, all of a sudden you can justify to yourself, right? You're not really trying to go ahead, you're trying to regain your natural position after all. Human rationalization is really quite amazing, right? The stories we can tell ourselves are really quite fantastic. And under the right conditions, we can tell ourselves all kinds of fabulous stories.
Yeah, it's great. And what about institutional psychology? I mean, when you're inside an organization and the organization puts, has a public story and a private story. I mean, which is true really of all organizations, I would say, just about. And are you already almost on a slippery slope at that point?
Yeah, so in Japanese there's a separate word for the real truth and for the truth that you show outside. And I think we all have it, maybe we're not as explicit about that. And maybe in personal relationship it's not that bad if you have an internal truth and the truth you tell other people. But what if you're an accountant and you have a different description of reality that is the truth and a different reality you present to other people? Or if you have clients and you have a different version of the truth than the one you show them to the other person. Now it's becoming incredibly dangerous. Now what's also interesting about organizations is that people start being loyal to the organization. So I've talked to all kinds of big cheaters, people who committed serious embezzlements and crimes and sat in jail for a long time. And quite a few of them started by cheating for the organization. It was out of loyalty to this entity that represented lots of people. Some of them they knew, some of them they didn't know. And out of loyalty to the organization, they basically did all kinds of things they shouldn't have done. And it's kind of tricky, because when you think about it, loyalty is a really wonderful trait. We want people to be loyal. We want people to be caring. And we want them to do it at the cost of all kinds of other things. For example, I would love, if you would be my friend, that your loyalty to me would override your selfish desires for yourself. I would like it that it would override some other needs that you have. But all of a sudden, what happens if it overrides other obligations we have to our clients, for example? And I think that the structure, particularly a structure in a group of people that you like and care about and are committed to, is going to create lots of opportunities for misbehavior.
And to be a whistleblower, and unless you just actively dislike the people you're working with and are already alienated from them, to be a whistleblower really runs against the grain of human nature, right?
Yeah, the government creates tremendous incentives for whistleblowers. You get to potentially get a lot of money out of being a whistleblower, but it's incredibly hard. I think the social pressures against it are very hard. Even when kids are playing, right? There's really negative terms associated with somebody who goes and tell on their friends. And I think it continues throughout life. It's people who are basically not abiding by the structure of the social hierarchy, and they have to go outside of that, and it's incredibly difficult to be like that. And you can ask yourself, how would you become a deep friend of somebody who is a whistleblower? Or would you always think that there's something inherently wrong about that?
And worry what they would come to know about you. Okay, now there is some good news here. I mean, I guess the first good news is that we are not, most people are cheaters and liars, but most people are not egregious cheaters and liars, right?
We cheat much less than economic theory would predict. If you tomorrow do the following exercise, look at your own life and every moment ask yourself, what could I now steal or lie and never get caught and never get any punishment? You would find out lots of opportunities. You could go to your neighbors' homes and take all kinds of things. You could go to the office. There's all kinds of opportunities for us to cheat. And if we were perfectly rational people, we would cheat much, much more. So that's the first thing, is we don't cheat as much as rational economic theory would have. We cheat much, much less. The second thing is that the cases in which we are able to rationalize more or less are kind of predictable. So, for example, when something is multiple steps removed for money, people cheat more. When we think about our own morality, we cheat less. And if you start to understand what are the cases that allow more or less rationalization, now you can think, where should we regulate? Where should we be careful about?
Okay. So what's an example of that? In what area would you apply that?
So think about finance, right? How much should we regulate the financial markets? What we find is that when people cheat for something that is multiple steps removed from money, think like mortgage-backed securities rather than cash, people find it easier to be dishonest and think of themselves as honest. And this suggests that you should regulate to a higher degree areas that have these big distances for money. And things that are closer to cash, you need to regulate less. Think about physicians. The fact that we never mention money in our interactions with them. What does this suggest about the need to regulate?
Okay. Now, as for the fact that we don't cheat as much as you might think we theoretically should if we're rational, I might say to that, well, okay, so the chances of my stealing at work, the chances of getting caught are like 1 in 10,000. But it's also true that if I made a habit of doing it for my whole life, the chances might grow. So I'm not sure I'd say that it's really irrational to avoid that. The opportunity to cheat in that kind of context. But there's an experiment you cite where cab drivers, I think it was, were given the opportunity to cheat a blind person, and it was kind of like a one-time thing. I mean, they don't have many blind customers. Yeah. And what happened there?
By the way, if you say that the rational thing to do is not to get into a habit, you just don't get into a habit.
You just do it once or twice.
Once or twice. And you can also think to yourself, if you found the wallet of a colleague on the floor,
right,
and you could pick it up and never be found out, would you do it?
True.
Now, in the cab driver, what we wanted to know is whether people would cheat more when somebody cannot find out about them, or will they take the benefit of that person into account? And what we found is that when people had a blind person and they could cheat them much more without being caught, they actually didn't, and they cheated them less than a sighted person. So not only do people not take full advantage of being caught and getting away with it as much as possible, they actually think about the benefit of the other person, and in this case, cheat less.
And is the speculation there that what they're doing it's like a really good opportunity to convince themselves that they're good people, to just do that once?
I think that when the blind person comes into the cab, it's very clear that you can cheat them. And because of that, people become more scrutinized of their own behavior. They become more careful, and therefore they're able to get away with less dishonesty. They're basically much more cautious.
Okay, so it's I guess good news that people are not only tend not to cheat a blind person, but are less likely to cheat a blind person than to cheat a sighted person. Before we go, do you have any other inspiring things to say about human nature?
Yeah, I think that one of the most optimistic thing we're finding is we're finding that once people ask for forgiveness, they can start a new page. So here's what happened. People start cheating. At some point you think to yourself, well, I'm a bad person, I might as well go for it. There's a slippery slope. People start cheating a lot. And what we find is if we stop people at that point and give them a chance to say sorry, say what they have done, and repent, they start a new page. And I think this is, of course, something that religion has figured out. The Catholic confession, the Day of Atonement. And in civic society, we also discovered it a little bit. In South Africa, right? After the apartheid, there was this idea that we would just ask for forgiveness and start a new page in terms of the relationship between the different races. I think that, the evidence is that this kind of mechanism actually works, and as long as we try to implement it in more areas of civic life, I think we will do better. So what can we do with our physicians, doctors, lawyers, bankers, politicians? I think there's a lot of chances in kind of learning a lesson and getting people to confess and start a new page.
So religions, there's a lot of implied wisdom about human nature in religions.
I think absolutely yes.
And it's interesting, the different systems, for governing this. The fact, it seems to me all religions have to face exactly the fact that you describe in the book, which is that they want to have prohibitions on certain kinds of behavior, and yet just about everyone does engage in those kinds of behaviors to some extent. So lying, cheating, and they have different ways of handling them. So the idea of karma, is one way. Is like, okay, still, you do want the good to greatly outweigh the bad, right? If you want to get reincarnated in good shape. The Christian model is very different. It is this more binary, like, oh, I've sinned, okay, you get forgiven. And you've just explained that is that has a certain kind of logic behind it, because forgiveness does trigger at least a certain period of genuine reform.
Yeah, and if you think about it, karma is a much more continuous model.
Right.
And you could just switch. But if it's heaven and hell are binary, if you're going to hell, there's nothing you can do, and therefore confession is incredibly important in the binary model.
Right. It's more important in Catholicism. I mean, in the Protestant tradition I was brought up in, it was like, strictly speaking, the prerequisite for heaven was not about not having sin. It was about accepting Jesus as your Savior, recognizing sin, and trying not to do it. So
I think Catholicism, puts very few. Catholicism is incredibly tough, has a lot of restrictions.
Yeah.
Protestant religion is much looser in that regard. It's easier to be a Protestant.
Well, it depends. I was a Southern Baptist, and you weren't supposed to drink or dance.
So that's tougher. but the nice thing,
the virtue of the Catholic model is it's a kind of like, you can do anything, just make sure you go to confession afterwards. Although, of course, it's hard to confess to a priest you actually know that you just robbed a bank.
That's right. But the good news is that when we do non-religious confession, it doesn't matter what denomination you are. This idea of stopping saying sorry allows people to start fresh.
Right. Okay. So we can all take that home. Well, listen, Dan, thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Entertaining and enlightening book, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. And there's also your large archive of podcasts, Arming the Donkey.
Yes.
That people should, I'm sure you wouldn't mind if they check those out.
No, I think it's great.
Yeah, I bet you do. and I'm sure you're being honest when you say that.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Dan.
My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.